Appreciate the prayer, brother. For the heart rate. Took the liberty shouldn't have him called him by his first name. We try not to do that. But we worked together for so many years and on a first name basis. But take your Bibles and turn to Exodus chapter 17. Had a thought of Joshua being a servant's servant. In Exodus chapter 17, a very well-known passage, chapter 17, verse 1, it says, "And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed in the wilderness of Sin, after their journey according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink." I want to read that verse. I want us to drop down, and I want us to look at verse 8. Look at verse 8. I read that for a reason. As you're looking there at verse 8, I wanted to point out that for a reason. For this sake, Joshua, this is right where Joshua comes on the scene. This is right where we first see Joshua. He's first mentioned, I think this is the first time he's ever mentioned in the scriptures. And it comes at a great time for Moses. Moses is now, he's in a bit of hot water, you could say. No pun intended, there's no water there, and that kind of put him in hot water with all the people. And they wanted to stone him, they wanted to kill him. And he goes to God and starts talking to God about this. And the people tempt the Lord and asking, is God among us? They look around, they've forgotten about all the things that God has done for them up to that point. They've forgotten about all the great victories. They've forgotten about all the areas of trouble that God has led them through. And now there's no water. And I can imagine if you're out in the desert and you're thirsty and all. I know when we would go backpacking through the Appalachian Trail, you start off with everything that you're going to have at the end of the week. You start off at the beginning of the week. All your food, but not all your water. You have to find your water as you go along the way. You ever heard the phrase, "Where in the blue blazes are we?" You ever heard that? Yeah, that comes from that's a backpacking term. The term comes, the blue blazes are how they would mark trees, so that if you were on a well-known trail and you saw a blue blaze, you knew that spur trail led to water. So as you're hiking along through the woods, if you ever, I don't know that any of us, at this point, I'm not super interested in hiking through the woods anymore and camping in a tent, sleeping on the ground. That's not super interesting to me anymore. It was when I was younger. But if you do and you find that blue marker, you'll know that you can start heading down that trail and you'll find water. I've been on trails before where the trail, somebody marked it and the water was there, but their ability to gauge the distance between that marker and where the water was not accurate. They made it look, they gave the impression it was about maybe 4/10 of a mile, and 3 miles later you find the water. That's a big deal when you've got a 50-mile hike and you add on 6 miles. That doesn't turn out to be a real fun day. People get a little bit upset, get a little frustrated, get a little aggravated, a little bothered. And that's what's going on here with Moses. Is these people are thirsty, they're hot, they've got family around them. They're looking at all that they love and they care for, and seeing it about to evaporate away. And they are hot and angry at Moses, but they've forgotten God in the whole thing. And on comes probably one of the greatest servants in the Bible, a servant to a servant. Joshua in multiple spots in Joshua 24:19, Exodus 24:19 and Joshua 1:1, it refers to Joshua as Moses' minister. And that word minister there is simply a servant's servant. He ministered to Moses. Moses was a servant of God. and yet God gave him a servant. And so let's look at verse 8. Verse 8. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel and Rephidim. And Moses said unto Joshua, choose us out men, and go out to fight. And go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him, and fought with Amalek. And Moses and Aaron and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar, and called the name thereof Jehovah Nissi. For he said, because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Joshua here is the first time he's mentioned. He simply does what he's Moses' servant, but he simply does what God tells him, or what God's man tells him to do. He goes out and he serves. He goes out into war. I thought about this passage when I was looking this over, and I thought about it as our missionaries. How many times our missionaries, they surrender, and I understand half of us here are missionaries, the other half are here serving. You might as well be missionaries the way you serve. And I appreciate your service, and that's why I try to truthfully and humbly come by and say thank you as often as I can for all that you do. I'm grateful for all that you do. But I noticed in this passage that Joshua couldn't see what was going on. He simply went out onto the field of battle and he served. He went out there, and Moses and the others could see it. God told Moses to write it down and then rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. I think he did it for a couple of reasons. I think he did it, one, because Joshua was down there in the thick of the battle fighting. He didn't really have time to figure out all of what was going on, whether Moses' hands were up or down. He wasn't able to see the two and connect it together, that the reason he was winning was because God was blessing him from God's servant's sake, as Moses was relying on God for the victory. And then he couldn't have seen nor understood the time in which Moses' arms would fail and he would start to lose. And when others around him recognized what was going on, they came over and they made a place for Joshua or for Moses to sit, and then they held his arms up. And I believe that's our role for each one of us, especially here in the home office, for our missionaries that are out in their respective fields. I noticed that Joshua, though he was undoubtedly, though he was a warrior, yes, he was in this case. Later on in his life, he was a leader. No matter what, he was always a servant at heart. First and foremost, he was a servant. You ever think about that statement? We use a lot of idioms and a lot of statements and phrases and stuff. I think sometimes we just learn where they plug in, but we don't think about what they mean. First and foremost, Joshua was a servant. The first thing we see with him was he was a servant. And foremost, it deals with rank and position. Not rank and position being second under command, though it does deal with that some of second under Moses, but it deals with the fact that first and foremost, in his heart, the most important thing was he was a servant. Every step of the way throughout his entire life, he was a servant. You see him being called a servant you see him serving in the beginning, being called a servant in multiple places. But then at the end of his story, he says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Joshua, it was rehearsed in Joshua's ears because he understood. God wanted him to understand. Now, Joshua had no idea what he was going to be doing later on in life. He was just serving. But what he learned from his serving was that it took others to give him the victory. And that everybody, being a servant's servant, brought him victory. Aaron and Hur that day were servants to the servant of a servant. Think about that one for a while. And it brought victory. A victory that went beyond him. It went beyond that generation. And it served for generations later on. You'll notice if we had time to go back and read through that passage, you would notice that Joshua is not the one credited with getting the victory while Moses' hands were up. It's Israel. When others served and helped him out, helped Joshua to fight, it was the people that gained the victory. But later, Joshua is given the credit for it. I think it's done that way to show us that God never forgets what his servants do. He is keenly aware of everything that his servants do. But he wants us to be aware of what our service does for others. When we serve God and we serve others, that's exactly what we are designed to do. I thought about this fact when I was looking through. I read the word and it first popped out as discomforted with the edge of the sword. And I thought, well, if somebody came at you with if somebody was hacking your people, that would be discomforting. But that's not what it says. It says discomfort. Let me look at the word again. Discomfited. That word discomfited means that he took the edge of the sword and he weakened the enemy. Not only did he weaken Amalek, but he weakened Amalek's people. He weakened. It's very much like what our missionaries do when they go in and they preach in the prisons. They preach the word of God, and it opens the eyes of the blind. It gives hope to those that are backslidden. It lifts them up. It helps to bring them back. It weakens Satan's hold over the lost and sin's grip on the saint that's backslidden. All because of a servant who is just simply willing to do what he was responsible for and what he was commanded to do. I think one of the greatest things that, one of the things I desire in this office, and it's not just because I've been asked to be office manager or anything. I love serving God. I absolutely love and adore this ministry. I love what God's given me. I love every missionary that God has given this ministry. I've been out on the field. I've been there in the times. I remember when one of our missionaries called me from out in the Midwest. Out in the middle of nowhere, he called me. Our vehicle had just broken down. I was on the way to school. And man, I wanted to be there at school. I was so excited to be at school today. So when I started up that West Virginia mountain, and the vehicle decided it didn't want to go the rest of the way, and it finally coasted. I threw a rod through the bottom of the motor. Part of it was sticking out of the oil pan. I remember getting there and looking at it, seeing all that, stepping out into the middle of the highway because it was the only spot I could find cell service. It was right in the middle of the highway. And I don't mean that it was a broad amount of grass between each side. It was that metal barrier. I know some of y'all look at me like, you're not supposed to do that. Hey, you got to make a call. You got to make a call, okay? You got to do what you got to do sometimes. I'm standing there in between those metal dividers that are supposed to slow down a vehicle if they hit them. And I'm making a call, and I'm telling the principal, I'm not going to make it today. I don't think I'll be able to make it there. By the time I get a tow truck here, half of the school day will probably be gone. I walked up to the top. After that, I couldn't get a cell service. Went to the top of the mountain, called my wife, and said, here's where I'm at. I don't know how long I have a cell service here. I'm going to call the tow truck company. You call them too. And we'll both tell them we need to get them where I'm at. I'm about 11 miles away from this exit, and that's where I was at. She said, what are we going to do? I said, same thing we always do. We're going to pray and we're going to serve God. We're just going to go forward. God will take care of it. Well, what about the vehicle? I said, God will take care of it. I said, God can put a new motor in this before we ever get home. I'm not worried about it. Tow truck driver gets there, pulls up, and I wanted a chance to talk to him. So I'm sitting there hooking things up. I don't know why he let me do it. I still have no idea why. Because if I'd hooked something up wrong and that vehicle fell off, he'd have been liable for it. I'm over there hooking chains up, and I'm thinking, this looks like a good spot to hook it on. And we're strapping it down. Hey, I was going to be up in front. If the vehicle fell off, the motor was already dead. What's it matter, right? And God let me sit there and preach to him 2 messages. I didn't tell him I was preaching 2 messages I had recently preached for 3 hours, and he wept like a baby. And then I get a phone call from one of our missionaries out in the Midwest. And he said, God put you on my heart to call. I said, well, I believe he did. He said, no. I know God put you on my heart to call. He said, how's your vehicle? I thought, that's a funny question. Funny you should ask. I said, it's doing all right. I said, we blew up the motor in it. He said, I'll have a check in the mail for you. The missionary sacrificed. Within no time at all, we had the best motor you could buy for that vehicle, in that vehicle. And we went on, and we saw more souls saved. Sitting here today, do not take, I don't have time to get to the rest. Don't take anything you do today lightly. You're a servant of God. You're a servant to servants. Everything you do today, let it be led of God. You never know the impact you might make in somebody else's life and the generations beyond that it might impact. All right. Brother Devin, you had a verse of a song other than the one